My guest today is writer and commentator and documentary filmmaker John Robson. I'm sure many of you have read his columns in the National Post and also other publications. John is also a radio commentator. You can see his work at johnrobson.ca. He's also joining us today by Skype from his home in Ottawa. Today, we will have a discussion about the current coronavirus crisis and the economic crisis that affects Canada and the whole world. John, thank you for being with us. Welcome to my show.
Thank you.
Yeah, John, so thank you for giving us your time, and let's have a discussion. But before starting to speak about the coronavirus crisis, I just want to go back to the economic crisis that we're having right now. Some economists are saying that the coronavirus crisis is only the beginning of the economic crisis because we had a lot of bubbles after the 2008 financial crisis. The Bank of Canada and the Fed print a lot of money out of thin air to supposedly stimulate the economy, and that created the bubbles. And these bubbles were looking for a pin to prick the bubbles, and the pin is the coronavirus crisis. What do you think about that theory?
Well, I think we're running into something of a reality moment. And it's a reality moment in terms of how economics really works. We spend most of our time talking as though there was this thing called the economy that existed separately from the sum total of all the things people were making and using up in a society. And what we're realizing with the coronavirus crisis is that if people are not going to work, if they're not making things, goods or services, they don't have to be tangible things, then that is a recession. It's not like it will cause a recession. It really is a recession. And governments are still living in the world of make-believe, where they think, well, if the economy's not doing well, we can inject liquidity. Like they've got a big tank of it up in the Peace Tower or something from outside the economy. And so it doesn't matter that there's less wealth because they'll make more. And this idea of injection, I think of it as like, someone's dehydrated in hospital and they put a needle in their arm and then they put in saline solution. But the trouble is the other end is in our leg, right? It all just comes from us. And so all these things that governments do where they think if they borrow money against no asset, or if they print money with nothing behind it, then the economy does better. And it doesn't matter that we're not. And we're realizing now that's not true. That if everybody's off work for a month, we're really going to be poorer. And there's no jiggery pokery. There's no magic tricks government can do. If the prime minister wants to give $100 billion to people, he's got to take it from other people. Or he takes it from the same people and gives it back to them and says, don't you feel better now? It's like, well, no. It's like with that saline solution. That was, I'm no better hydrated than I was. And all these kind of devices that governments use, well, they say, oh, dear, the economy is doing badly, 2008. Let's lower interest rates and then there'll be more money. Well, yeah, there might be, but there won't be more wealth. There'll just be more dollars chasing less stuff. And that's a recipe for inflation, or else nothing will happen. They keep lowering the interest rate and people just don't borrow. And they're like, well, that's weird. It's like, well, no, I've got no productive use for the money at the moment. Things aren't looking good. And so now we're in a situation, if people stay home for a month, how many restaurants are going to close? And then it's not just the waiters aren't earning money or the cooks, the people aren't getting restaurant food. We're really poorer. And you can't change that except by getting people back to work. Some people are still working, of course, thank goodness the power's on, the water's on. That's because people are still going to work in power plants. People are still putting food on shelves. A friend of mine is a rancher. Someone said, hey, why are you out feeding the cows? Why don't you self-isolate? And he had to kind of explain to them about where food comes from. But the governments really don't seem to understand this. And I think a lot of economists don't. They talk about the Y line, C plus I plus G plus X minus M. It's like, well, what about actual people in factories making things or else at home not making them? Because that's all there is the sum total of what we each individually do.
Yeah, to create wealth, we need people to work. First of all, we work, we create wealth, and we get paid. So that's the real money. But now what's happening with the Fed and the Bank of Canada just said recently that they will do everything to buy bonds and corporate bonds and maybe stock from the stock markets, and also at the same time try to put a lot of liquidity in the market. But that's money out of thin air. Like you just said, it cannot create any wealth. We need people to work. And at the end, that will create inflation. And when we'll have inflation, like you just said, everybody will be poor. So that's why now with the coronavirus, people are saying, okay, you must stay at home and we must do that for a couple of weeks. But after that, we will kickstart the economy with more spending and more borrowing, but it won't work. What do you think about the way to manage the equilibrium between the coronavirus crisis and the public health? On the other side, the economy and people working. So we need to have, and we will need to speak about that in Canada in a couple of weeks, to have a balanced approach.
Yeah, I mean, what we normally do with diseases, and we're not doing it right now with this one, I don't know why not, is when we look at it, we say, how many extra deaths do we expect to happen in the country this year? How many people will die this year because of this disease who would not otherwise have died? Because obviously, if you get a pandemic that is very contagious and very lethal, that's an extremely high number. You've got to lock everything down and weather the storm. But we also need to ask ourselves, how many people are going to die if we knock a quarter off the GDP? If a whole lot of businesses fail and people despair, they see their hopes evaporate, their dreams are lost, because we know very clearly that the main determinants of health really are socioeconomic. Loneliness kills people, poverty kills people. And so if you have a disease that, if at the worst case scenario, is going to add 10 deaths a day, and you don't want anybody to die, but how many people are going to die if we lock the economy down for 3 months? And we need to where the lines cross, you have to end the quarantine. I saw a very interesting talk by a German microbiologist who said, our nightmare scenario in Germany is 1 million people get it and 30 people a day die from COVID-19. But he said, in Germany, we have over 2,200 people over 65 who die every day, and at least 20 of them already have a COVID virus. So how many extra deaths are we really looking at from the disease versus how many people will die if we don't get people back to work? And I mean, right away with the farmers, how many people would die if farmers weren't working? Well, everybody, because there'd be no food. How many people would die if the electricity went off? So we're already sending people to work knowing it might increase the danger of the contagion. But, and again, if you look at Italy, which is the nightmare scenario, but in Italy, the average age of the people who've died is 79 and a half. And on average, almost half of them have 3 other diseases at the time that they die. And so, although nobody wants to die, but again, and this German microbiologist pointed this out, elderly people who live for their shuffleboard and their bridge game and their social excursions, now they're sitting in their house just watching the clock tick. This is going to kill people too. So you don't want to be stupid. We don't want to go after spring break and start partying, but we want to say in 2 or 3 weeks, what is the disease curve looking like? And what are the dangers to us all from poverty? And when the government thinks, well, there won't be any poverty because we'll just kickstart the economy, that deceives us about what can really happen. Businesses are shuttered. People aren't earning wages. They're having trouble paying their rent. Landlords have a choice between evicting the tenant and having no income or just not getting the rent and having no income. But, landlords, people say, oh, boo, landlords, but they're human beings with families too. They want to, give their kid braces and stuff. So we really need to understand that wealth comes from the creative activity of individuals. If there's less of that, we're poorer. If the government gives us $100 billion, it takes it from somebody. So somebody's $100 billion better off, somebody's $100 billion worse off in an economy that's hurting. That's going to be hard for them to sustain. So we can't imagine the government can save us by magic. I mean, the disease is bad, right? It's not like we could save us from the disease by magic either. There will be real costs, but let's not. Another professor of medicine said it's like an elephant attacked by a house cat that gets so annoyed it runs off a cliff. And obviously, this is a worse solution than just putting up with the cat. So we have to think about this, realizing there are real costs to both courses of action, and the government can't make any of them vanish by doing some Keynesian booga booga at us. That stuff doesn't work. It never did, and it couldn't.
Yeah, absolutely. And yeah, speaking about the government, as you know, today the government will be sitting, the parliament will resume, and they will have a discussion, and they are having a discussion right now on the emergency crisis bill. So, and people were saying, Maxime, as a politician, you must be everybody must be all united behind the government during a time of crisis. Yes and no. You know, it's as a politician, it's my role to criticize the government when they're doing something that it's against the will of the population or against our values. So they were supposed to table a bill and having a special clause that will permit the government to spend more money, to borrow more money without the approval of the parliament until 2021. But I think they would draw that, and that won't be part of the bill. So that's a good thing. The government understands that, you know, we are a parliamentary democracy, and the government must be able to deal with the members of parliament on important policies. So what do you think about that discussion on an emergency bill that will give a lot of power to the government?
Well, I'm glad we got Magna Carta back out of the fire there. It was a really strange thing for them to suggest they could already tax and spend. The only problem is they would have to explain what they were doing, and they said, we don't want to do that. And I wrote about this recently in an online publication called Loony Politics, and I said, you know, in a time of crisis, it's tempting to say, oh, put all our divisions behind us. But in Britain in 1915, a very difficult part of the First World War, there was a big crisis because of poor quality shells produced in insufficient numbers. And the opposition press was on it, and the newspapers were on it, and it brought down the prime minister. And the alternative was to say, let's all pull together and lose the war, because nobody says anything about the fact that we're not arming our soldiers properly. And remember, in World War I, the Germans could listen and go, oh, hey, the British have terrible shells. This is the moment. You know, the virus can't even hear us. But this is a very good time to ask questions. You know, it's one thing if nothing much is happening and the government bungles, it's like, oh, well, that's life. But when you're in a really dangerous situation, when you're taking decisions with enormous implications, this is when you most need people saying, hang on a sec, what is it that you're doing? As opposed to going, oh, well, I guess Justin Trudeau suddenly became all wise. I think this is highly unlikely. And again, he's in a minority parliament, so he's thinking, well, I can only pass legislation if I can actually convince people it's not stupid. What a terrible way to go about. No, it's not. It's a great way to do things. That's exactly how we should do them. I mean, I know partisan politics can get kind of ugly, but I said in a column that's going in the National Post, you know, the alternative to having a bunch of donkeys braying at each other is to have them all braying at us, and that doesn't make life better. We want people asking questions like, who's going to pay for this? Where do you keep your liquidity? How are we really sure the disease is that dangerous? Because again, we know that even the cases that we know about, it seems like the case fatality rate may be 1 in 100, maybe less. But of course, we know about the worst cases. We don't know how many people in Ottawa. The medical officer of health said, well, we know about 21 cases, but there are probably 2,000. That was some days ago, meaning that a lot of people have had it and are probably now immune who never suffered very serious symptoms. That doesn't mean we all run out of the house, right, as I say, but it means somebody's got to be asking the prime minister, what do you really know about this? How much do you understand the epidemiology? And if he's got good answers, well, I'll say, hooray, thank you for that, and it won't be a problem. And if his answers are bad, he shouldn't just be able to say, well, ask me again in 2021. It'll be too late then.
Yeah. And what is your take about the way that the Chinese government deal with that situation, lying to us and you know, the virus origin from China. And I know that President Trump is calling the Chinese flu. And some people are saying, you know, it's not politically correct. But usually when you have a flu, you call it, you know, the name of where it is coming from. So what do you think about the way that China react to the world? And it took some time before telling us the truth about that.
Well, it took some time. They're still not telling us the truth. I know the Epoch Times, which I also write, they call it the Chinese Communist Party virus. So you can't say they're being bigoted. But right now, the Chinese are claiming they have no new cases. And the New York Times believes them, apparently. But the Epoch Times printed some confidential Chinese government memos about new cases. Obviously, the Chinese have lied the whole way. And, Trudeau once carelessly said he admired China's dictatorship because they could turn on a dime. But this whole episode shows what dictatorship does. They lied about it. They downplayed the problem. They imprisoned doctors who tried to alert the world, and then they're still lying to us. They've still got new cases. I mean, how could it have suddenly stopped? It's one thing to bend the curve down, but they were saying no new cases in a nation of 1.3 billion people that was hard hit in February. There are no new cases. And I mean, I don't understand why they say it, but why do we believe it? What rubbish. It's the open societies where you can have debates about everything, like maybe we shouldn't call it Wuhan virus. I mean, my answer is we still call Marburg virus. Doesn't mean we're anti-German. Now, I got the Spanish are still mad about Spanish flu, though. The interesting thing is that it got called that because Spain was neutral in World War I, so they had less censorship. So we heard about it being in Spain. Everyone else was like, shut up, don't mention the flu. But I mean, if it's really, really important to people that I not call it Wuhan virus, give me another name, because COVID-19, we can't keep calling it that. And let's worry about that after we get a handle on what's really happening in China. Because again, a number of these illnesses have come out of China. And one of the reasons why is they have incompetent and dishonest disease control because they're run by communist tyrants. And I'm a lot more worried about the communist tyranny than I am about somebody getting bent out of shape because I said Wuhan virus. I mean, it's like if somebody called something the Scottish plague, I wouldn't say you've just dishonored my ancestors, who are a mixed bunch anyway.
Yeah, I was in the beginning of all that, I was calling the government to close our borders and from people coming from China. And on Twitter and social media, people were saying, Maxime, it's a little bit racist saying that. But that was not, the way that the government acted in the beginning of that crisis was not the best way for Canadians. And, our borders were open for too long before Trudeau took his decision to close it. And I think it's important in a moment like that to speak about a nation. Trudeau with his open borders and, we're supposed to be a post-national state and believing in everything coming from the UN. I think right now people will look at their national government and a government that control its borders. That's what the nation is. You must control your borders if you want to be a real nation. I think people are looking to the government, but at the same time, the government cannot save us. It will be people who will save us by their actions, staying at home right now, and also, the economy. That's people who produce and work that create wealth. What do you think about the way that the Trudeau government reacted in the beginning of the crisis, not closing our borders?
Well, yeah, that was a classic politically correct response, including the idea, well, what about the illegal migrants? And they're like, oh, well, we can't possibly do anything about that. And then one day they realized they could, and they did it. And Amnesty International said, no, it's illegal to control illegal immigration, which I thought was a classic, reverting to what you know in a crisis. But the other thing that's interesting is that because this disease started in a place that's overwhelmingly ethnically Chinese, therefore most of the visitors to that place for tourism, to see family on business, were also ethnically Chinese. I mean, they're Canadian, right? I don't hyphenate people. They're not Chinese Canadian. They're just Canadian, but they're, of Chinese ethnic background. So that meant that if we didn't control the flow of people, the communities liable to be hardest hit in Canada, initially at least, were Chinese. Yeah. Ethnically. And so the idea that it was bigoted to say, well, let's make sure these people don't get sick was kind of weird. And of course, and I've seen people saying, well, look, I can talk about this because I'm Asian or part Asian. I can say, oh, it's coming from China. Well, it's like anybody should be able to say that. And if it had been from a place that was more ethnically diverse than China, we'd still have wanted to control the flights, not because we thought that the specific ethnic groups there should be jeered at, but just because that's where the disease was coming from. And again, I think it's a bit of a reality thing, like the economics. One moment you're saying, oh, don't call it this, oh, don't. And the next moment you're going, holy cow, people might die. We better stop being silly and start actually acting. And yeah, so we try and close the national borders. Like there are these orders not to move around. Well, of course, they're coming from the federal government or the provincial government. They're not coming from the UN. The Indian government apparently has just said, nobody leave your house, which I think is not probably wise. But who's going to be telling Indians what to do? Well, it's the Indian government. obviously. And our government suddenly turned out to be a national government, and rightly so. There's a great line from Bertrand Juvenal, who said that he believed in world government until he crossed the Swiss border just ahead of the pursuing Nazis. There's a lot to be said for national governments because they help. They're sort of a break against political madness and violence and oppression. It'd be nice if we all had democracy, but since we don't, let's start by preserving it here. And again, the Trudeau idea that maybe I should just be allowed to tax you without representation. People think maybe that's American. It goes back as far as a statute whose title is in Latin, De Tellagio non concedendo, in 1297. Edward I promised he wouldn't tax the English-speaking people without the consent of their representatives. This is deep in our constitutional roots. And again, anybody who comes here, I don't care where you're from or what you look like, when you come to Canada and become Canadian, Magna Carta is yours. And help us hang on to it, because politicians will panic and they will get hungry for power. But the last thing you need in a crisis is a politician whose foolish decisions are not subject to scrutiny. Again, as I said, that's less dangerous when nothing much is going on than when something really serious is happening.
And other politicians that don't have the courage to criticize the government. I think you're right. We are in the democracy, and no taxation without representation. That's the basic principle of our democracy. So that being said, what is your expectation for the future? So after the crisis, we'll have to stay at home for a couple of weeks, but it will end a day because people will need to work and the economy must go on. So, but that will end. We don't know when. What is your expectation about the government and the action from the government after that? I know usually mainstream economists are calling for a big stimulus to kickstart the economy, but we cannot, like you said in the beginning, kickstart the economy with borrowed money. We cannot spend our way to prosperity with borrowed money or printed money from the Fed or from the Bank of Canada. What do you think will happen after the crisis?
I think that initially people probably will say just what you said. Hey, you got to stimulate the economy. But then they'll go, hey, wait a minute. There's $100 billion deficit, right? They're spending a whole lot of money. Tax revenue's down. Businesses are hurting. Nobody wants to buy Canadian government bonds, right? I mean, all governments are doing this. Where do they think the money's coming from? And they're going to have to think maybe for the first time, I mean, maybe the 80s, but even going back to the 1920s, to realize we need less government right now. We need fewer regulations. We need less onerous taxes. We need to get out of the way of people who are putting the thing back together. I mean, we have, again, to take the example, we think we have public health care in this country, and it's wonderful, the public sector. But, doctors are in private practice. Their cars are made in private factories. The food they eat is grown on private farms. The bricks for the buildings, it's the private sector that creates the wealth that government then appropriates. And some people are going to start understanding that all that talk about stimulus is unreal. It's not a matter of should we or shouldn't we. We can't. What creates wealth is entrepreneurs and people working hard who don't have the government in their way. And we're going to see that if we've got to get the restaurants open again, we've got to get the factories producing goods, we've got to get the offices working, all these kinds of things. We need less government, not more. I mean, that may be wishful thinking, right? Everybody, including me, reverts to what they know in a crisis. But I think they're going to realize when you've got $100 billion deficit, you can't go and add another 50 billion to it. People are going to, and it's always funny. Somebody was saying, well, we need the stimulus. Too bad the deficit's already 30 billion. And I said, why is that bad? If you think deficits stimulate the economy, you should wish it was higher. If 100 billion is good, why not 150 billion? And that emphasizes that no, deficit spending doesn't work. And we'll do the right thing because we'll have exhausted the alternatives.
Yeah. And I think people must understand that you cannot create wealth with government spending, but it is by entrepreneur investing. We need investment, more growth, but not the spending money out of thin air. Yeah, you're right, because the deficit somebody will have to pay for that. It will be us with taxes in the future, or it will be everybody by inflation, because if that deficit it's monetarized by the central bank, that will create inflation at the end. And when we have inflation, everybody is losing. It's a losing game for everybody. I said recently that we will be poor in the near future because of that economic crisis and at the same time, the coronavirus crisis. So there's a cost for that. And it's too bad, but that can be a huge cost if we have a recession that will be for a couple of months, of years. That will affect everybody. And if the government is spending the money that we don't have, it will worsen the situation.
Yeah, and what happens to debt servicing costs, especially if people see that they're trying to monetize some of it and their expectations for inflation go up and they start demanding higher interest rates? These things, there's an economist, Rudy Dornbush, who said that in economics, things happen more slowly than you thought they could, and then they happen faster than you thought possible. And I think that the Trudeau government is very likely to run out of borrowing room, and possibly the Ontario government as well, with dramatic suddenness, to say nothing of governments in Atlantic Canada that were already in more trouble. And again, I think politicians need to take their version of the Hippocratic Oath. First, do no harm. Figure out what you shouldn't do and don't do it, and then start figuring out what you should do. And again, yeah, we've got to get people back to work. You know, if we've got to get people in restaurants cooking meals and cleaning and all these kinds of unglamorous, possibly, activities that make life livable. And they don't need a pile of extra regulations. They don't need higher taxes. They don't need government destroying the value of savings through inflation. They don't need any of the things government can do. What they need is for government to recognize that it's overextended too. And, you know, when you're in a hole, what do? You stop digging first thing. So I hope that governments will stop digging. You know, the American government did in the 1920s when it paid off the national debt. It lowered taxes. It removed regulations. You had a decade-long boom. Then you get to the New Deal, and Franklin Delano Roosevelt saved us all with all kinds of things, including deficit spending, and you had a 10-year depression. And everyone said, hey, FDR is the best. But in fact, it would have ended much sooner if the government had been less active. And that back then, the government had room. Right now, I mean, again, $100 billion deficit. Think about that. That's even Harper, in the depths of the 2008 recession, they ran a $50 billion deficit, and that was for 1 year. This is not something even the most ardent Keynesian thinks you can sustain. So let's just recognize why you can't. It's because it's not a good idea.
And we must learn from the past. After the 2008 financial crisis, the Bank of Canada and every government encouraged people to borrow and spend, and they created money with quantitative easing and easy money and Keynesian monetary policies. But at the end, we had the worst decade after the 1930s. If you look at the economic growth in our country, it was an average of 2% a year economic growth for the last 10 years. So that was one of the worst decade of economic growth in our country after the 1930s. So it's not working. And I hope that the free market and people who understand that, I don't want our children and grandchildren to pay for that in a couple of years.
Yeah, we're also paying because that idea that we could borrow our way to prosperity, Canadians are very personally indebted. It's not just our governments. I mean, Ontario is the most indebted subnational jurisdiction in the world, and they don't have an impressive range of assets to explain it. I don't even see, the barbecue and the yacht. But Canadians took on too much debt as well. And then when real trouble comes, you're already in a difficult position. So yeah, we have to get away from the idea that artificially low interest rates, I mean, like anything else, if government subsidizes it, you get more than you should. And if they penalize it, you get less than you should. We've already had too much borrowing. And again, we did that in good times and bad. And now we're in really bad times. And there's just, surely people have to stop believing in it. Interest rates have been very low for more than a decade. It was supposed to stimulate the economy, but the economy didn't look very stimulated. The economy looked kind of bored. And I think that we're just going to have to get back to the old time understanding of free markets, because we've tried everything else. There's no more magic tricks. Deficits don't work. Cheap money doesn't work. Free silver, as I called it the other day. But hard work and ingenuity and determination, those are the things that work. And Canadians have those in great quantities. And it's simply time to let us rebuild by using them.
And I think we are at a historical moment right now. And I hope that people will realize that, because all the policies from the past, like you said, didn't work. Now we need to focus on free markets, freedom, less government, fewer regulations, so that people will help us to go through that crisis, and not a big fat government. But I understand right now what the government is doing by helping and having very targeted measures. So that's okay. But I don't want our government to, after the coronavirus crisis, to spend more to stimulate the economy. That would be too bad for everybody. But we'll see what will happen, and you can count on us at the People's Party and on me to fight against these kind of huge stimulus spending, and coming from the government, but coming also from the central bank. So I want to thank you very much, John, for taking the time to be with us. I appreciate that. Do you have any ideas for people who are listening to us? If they want to look at your work, they have to go to your website. I think it's johnrobson.ca.
johnrobson.ca. Look at the climate discussion nexus. Read a good book, play cards, go out for a walk, but walk around people, and keep hope. Whatever else you do, keep hope, and we will get through this.
Yeah, we will. Thanks, John. I really appreciate your time. Have a nice day.
Thank you.
Thank
You
you.
too.